The cold wind howled through the ruins of an ancient alien city. Broken towers stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and shattered stone pathways crumbled under Darren's boots. His breath fogged up his visor as he scanned the area. His heart pounded. Somewhere in this desolate place, an alien princess was imprisoned, and he had come to free her. The mission had been simple: retrieve the Valari princess and escape before the enemy forces arrived. But standing before the hidden underground bunker, Darren knew this was no ordinary rescue. The place was eerily silent, with no guards, no defenses. It was too easy. He pushed forward, gripping his plasma rifle tightly. The bunker's entrance was sealed with a heavy metal door, rusted but still intact. He placed a small hacking device on the control panel, watching as its green light blinked rapidly. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. As the door slid aside, darkness swallowed the hallway ahead. Darren's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but he had no time to hesitate. He stepped inside, the dim emergency lights flickering as he moved forward. Then he saw her. The alien woman sat inside a high-tech containment cell, her wrists bound by energy cuffs. Her long, silver hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her skin shimmered faintly in the low light. Even in captivity, she held herself with a quiet dignity. Her eyes, glowing violet, snapped up to meet his. There was no fear in them, only curiosity. "You're human," she said, her voice smooth but tired. Darren knelt beside the control panel and began working on the cell's lock. "And you're Princess Calith." She tilted her head. "You came to free me." "That's the plan." He smirked but didn't look away from the screen. "Hold on." Almost there. With a final press of the button, the cuffs around her wrists deactivated with a faint hum. The containment field around the cell vanished, and Calith stepped forward, rubbing her wrists. She was taller than he expected, standing gracefully despite her time in captivity. For a brief moment, she studied him, and Darren got the strange feeling that she was assessing him rather than being grateful. "We need to move," he said. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "I am not weak, human." Darren chuckled. He liked her attitude. They hurried back through the bunker's hallway, the eerie silence pressing down on them. Something still felt off, but Darren ignored the feeling. The sooner they got out, the better. As they reached the exit, Calith suddenly stopped. "Wait," she whispered. "There is something you must know." Darren frowned. "Tell me on the ship." But before he could take another step, his entire body locked up. A sharp pain shot through his neck, spreading like fire down his spine. He gasped, falling to his knees. What is this?" he choked out. Calith knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, human. You did not ask the price for freeing me." Darren's hand shot to his neck, feeling something cold and metallic wrapped around it. A collar. Realization crashed over him like a wave. He had rescued her, only to become her prisoner. "You tricked me," he growled. Calith sighed. "Not tricked. I simply did what was necessary." Darren struggled, but his muscles wouldn't obey. The collar was controlling his nervous system. "I am of the Valari royal bloodline," she explained calmly. "The one who frees a royal must serve them. It is an ancient bond, unbreakable." His mind raced. Was this some kind of ritual? Some alien law? Calith placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not fight it, human. You will only make it worse." Darren clenched his jaw, anger and frustration boiling inside him. He had come to save a princess, not become a slave. "Why?" he demanded. "Why do this?" Calith hesitated. For the first time, she looked uncertain. But then her expression hardened. "You will understand soon," she said softly. "For now, you are mine." Darren's vision blurred as the collar pulsed, forcing his body into unconsciousness. The last thing he saw was Calith watching him, not with cruelty, but with something far more unsettling. Regret. Darren's eyes fluttered open, his head pounding. His vision blurred for a moment before clearing, revealing a grand chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls shimmered with a faint golden glow, and elegant alien symbols were carved into their surface. A large, circular window overlooked a vast starfield, the planet he had rescued Princess Calith from, now nothing more than a distant speck. He was no longer on the surface. He was in space. Darren pushed himself up, but the moment he tried to stand, a sharp jolt of pain shot through his body. He gritted his teeth, his hand instinctively going to his neck. The cold metal collar was still there. A soft voice echoed from behind him. "Do not struggle, human. The collar will resist you." Darren turned sharply, finding Calith standing near the entrance of the chamber. She had changed out of her tattered prison robes and now wore an elegant silver and violet outfit that shimmered under the room's light. She looked like a true princess. Darren forced himself to stay calm. "Where am I?" Calith stepped forward gracefully. "You are aboard my royal vessel, the Valeria. You should consider yourself fortunate, human. Few outsiders have ever seen its halls." Darren let out a bitter laugh. "Fortunate? I came to rescue you, and now you've enslaved me." Calith's violet eyes softened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "You misunderstand, Darren. This is the way of my people. The one who frees a royal must serve them." "That sounds an awful lot like slavery to me," he shot back. She sighed. "I expected you to resist. Humans are stubborn." Darren clenched his fists. He wasn't going to accept this. "Then take this thing off and let me go." Calith shook her head. "I cannot. Cannot, or will not." She hesitated, then admitted, "Both." Darren took a deep breath, trying to think. Fighting back would be useless right now. He needed to understand the situation first. "So what now?" he asked. "Do I just follow you around like some kind of pet?" Calith frowned at the word. "You are not a pet. You are my bound servant. Your role is to assist me, protect me, and serve as my companion. It is not an ordinary bond. The collar links us, body and mind." Darren's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Calith lifted a hand, and suddenly, Darren felt his own body move forward without his control. "What the?" He struggled, but his legs kept moving on their own until he stood just inches away from her. Calith lowered her hand, and he was finally able to stop. "This is the power of the bond," she explained. "I can guide your movements if needed, but it is not one-sided. Over time, you will feel my emotions, sense my thoughts." Darren's heart pounded. The idea of someone else controlling him made his skin crawl. Calith must have noticed his discomfort because she sighed again. "I will not force you unless I must. But understand, Darren, this bond cannot be undone." Darren exhaled sharply. No way to remove it. No way to escape. His mind raced, searching for a loophole, but before he could ask more questions, a knock came at the door. A tall alien figure entered, his dark blue armor polished to perfection. His golden eyes immediately locked onto Darren with curiosity and suspicion. "My lady," the warrior greeted Calith, giving her a respectful bow. "You have returned safely. The council awaits your presence." Calith nodded. "Very well." She glanced at Darren. "He will accompany me." Darren raised an eyebrow. "I will." "You are my bound servant," Calith said simply. "Where I go, you go." Darren clenched his jaw, but said nothing. For now, he would play along, but he wouldn't be a prisoner forever. As he followed Calith through the ship's elegant halls, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. He wasn't just trapped in an alien world. He was now tied to an alien princess in ways he didn't yet understand. And something told him this was only the beginning. Darren walked through the grand hallways of the Valeria, his hands clenched into fists. The golden glow of the walls cast a soft light over everything, but he wasn't admiring the beauty. His mind was racing. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was bound to Princess Calith. The metal collar around his neck was a constant reminder of that fact. It wasn't tight, it didn't hurt, but the power it held over him was terrifying. Caliph walked ahead with silent grace, her long silver hair flowing behind her. The alien warrior who had greeted them earlier walked beside her, throwing suspicious glances at Darren every few steps. Darren ignored him. He was too busy trying to understand his situation. How was he supposed to escape when his own body could be controlled? And why did Caliph look almost guilty when she spoke to him? His thoughts were interrupted when they reached a large chamber. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing an oval-shaped room with a floating circular table in the center. Several Valeri elders stood around it, their robes shimmering like liquid silver. The moment Darren stepped inside, all eyes turned to him. A tall, older Valeri with deep violet skin stepped forward, his golden eyes narrowing. He was clearly someone important. "Caliph," the elder said in a deep voice, "you have returned, and you have brought a human." Caliph lifted her chin. "He is my bound servant." A murmur spread through the elders. Some of them exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. The elder's expression darkened. "You bonded with a human." Darren frowned. The way he said it, it was like she had done something forbidden. Caliph's voice was firm. "He freed me." The bond formed naturally, as our laws dictate. The elder's gaze shifted to Darren, scanning him as if he were some kind of experiment. "Do you understand what you are now, human?" the elder asked. Darren crossed his arms. "From what I've been told, I'm stuck in this mess, whether I like it or not." A few of the elders frowned at his tone, but the elder simply nodded. "It is more than that." He turned to Caliph. "Have you told him?" Caliph's jaw tightened. "Not yet." Darren's patience snapped. "Told me what?" Caliph hesitated, then finally spoke. "The bond between a Valeri royal and their rescuer is more than just servitude. Over time, our minds and bodies begin to synchronize." Darren's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" The elder answered instead. "It means, human, that the longer you remain bound to her, the more like us you will become." Darren's breath caught. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. Caliph exhaled. "It has only happened a few times in history. The transformation is slow, but it is inevitable. Already, you must have felt the first signs." Darren clenched his fists. He had been feeling strange. His senses were sharper, his reflexes faster. Even his body felt stronger than before. "This is why bonding with a human is dangerous," another elder muttered. "They are unpredictable. Their minds are too wild to handle our connection." Darren glared at them. "So what? You're saying I'm going to turn into one of you?" Caliph's voice was quiet. "Not completely. But your mind will begin to merge with mine. Our thoughts, emotions, they will no longer be separate." Darren took a step back. The idea of his mind being connected to hers terrified him. "You should have told me," he snapped. Caliph's violet eyes flashed with something like regret. "Would you have listened?" Darren bit his lip. Would he? He didn't know. The elder spoke again. "There is another problem. Prince Vedran will not stand for this." Darren narrowed his eyes. "Who's Vedran?" Caliph's expression hardened. "My brother." Darren tensed. He hadn't expected that. The elder continued. "Prince Vedran was the one who had Caliph imprisoned. If he learns that she has returned, and that she is bonded to a human, he will see this as an insult." Caliph nodded, "which is why we must prepare. War may come." Darren turned his head slightly and saw Caliph standing there, her violet eyes filled with a strange sadness. "You should have known better, Darren," she said softly. Darren gritted his teeth, trying to fight back, but the collar's influence was too strong. He felt his body moving on its own, stepping out of the ship, walking toward her against his will. "You can't keep me here forever," he said through clenched teeth. Caliph sighed. "I do not wish to keep you as a prisoner, but I cannot let you leave. Why? Darren demanded. Just because of this stupid bond. Caliph hesitated, then whispered, because if you leave, you will die. Darren froze. What? She looked at him, her expression pained. The bond is not just a chain. It is a connection between us. If you try to run too far, your body will fail. You will not survive. Darren's blood ran cold. He had felt it the moment he tried to escape. The searing pain in his skull, the way his body refused to obey. She wasn't lying. He was physically incapable of leaving. His fists clenched. So I have no choice. Calith's voice was quiet. You do have a choice. You can accept this, or you can keep fighting it until it destroys you. Darren exhaled sharply. His entire plan, his one chance at freedom, had failed. And now he realized the terrible truth. He wasn't just trapped by Calith. He was trapped by himself. Darren sat in silence inside his chamber, staring at the smooth golden floor. His escape attempt had failed, and the weight of reality pressed heavily on his shoulders. The bond between him and Calith was more than just a control mechanism. It was something deeper, something he couldn't break no matter how hard he tried. If he left, he would die. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had always believed that freedom was a choice, but now he had none. The door slid open, and Calith stepped inside, moving with her usual grace. Her silver hair shimmered under the room's soft lights, but this time, there was something different about her. She looked tired. Darren didn't acknowledge her at first. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to look at her. But Calith was patient. She stood quietly, watching him, as if waiting for him to say something. Finally, she broke the silence. You are angry. Darren let out a cold chuckle. No kidding. I'm a prisoner with no chains. Can't say I've ever been in this situation before. Calith sighed. I told you, you are not a prisoner. The bond. The bond is a trap, Calith. Darren snapped, standing up. You say I have a choice, but I don't. If I run, I die. If I stay, I'm stuck with you forever. How is that fair? Calith's violet eyes softened. It is not fair. I know that. Darren hadn't expected that answer. He had expected her to defend herself, to argue, to try and justify what she had done. Instead, she looked genuinely guilty. You don't want this either, do you? Darren asked, studying her face. Calith hesitated. Then, for the first time, she lowered her gaze. No. That single word hit harder than Darren expected. He had assumed that Calith was in complete control, that she had wanted this bond. But now he saw something else. She was just as trapped as he was. Darren sighed, running a hand through his hair. Then why not remove it? Calith looked up again. Because it cannot be removed. Darren frowned. There has to be a way. Calith hesitated, then stepped closer. There is a way to change it. Darren's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. The bond is incomplete. Right now, it only keeps you tied to me. But if we complete the ritual, the connection will become equal. Darren's stomach twisted. Equal? How? Calith held out her hand, palm up. Right now, I have control over you. But if we finish the ritual, then you will have control over me as well. Our minds will be linked. I will feel what you feel, and you will feel what I feel. Darren took a step back. That sounds worse. Calith gave a small, sad smile. Perhaps, but it will give you some freedom. If we share the bond, I will no longer be your master. You will be my equal. Darren hesitated. It sounded too good to be true. But what's the catch? He asked. Calith's face darkened. The process is painful. It is not just a connection of the mind. It is a connection of the soul. Darren exhaled slowly. And if I don't do it? Calith met his gaze. Then you will remain a servant, and the bond will grow stronger until you lose yourself to it. A chill ran down Darren's spine. So either I complete the bond, or I become Nothing. Caliph didn't answer. She didn't have to. Darren ran a hand down his face. Great, just great. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, thinking. Then, finally, he looked at her and asked the question that had been burning inside him since the moment he woke up with the collar around his neck. Why did you do it? Caliph was silent for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, because I was afraid. Darren frowned. Afraid of what? Caliph exhaled slowly, as if she were struggling to find the right words. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of failing my people. Afraid of my brother finding me and killing me before I could take back my throne. Darren stared at her. For the first time, he saw her not as a princess, but as a person. She wasn't just some powerful alien who had enslaved him. She was a fugitive, a woman who had lost everything and had no one to trust. And she had chained him to her because she didn't want to be alone. Darren sighed. I hate this. Caliph gave a small nod. So do I. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, finally, Darren spoke. Fine. Let's do the ritual. Caliph's eyes widened slightly. Are you sure? Darren crossed his arms. No, but I don't have much of a choice, do I? Caliph studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Very well, human, she said softly. Tomorrow, we complete the bond. Darren exhaled, preparing himself for whatever was coming. He had no idea what he was about to face. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Darren stood inside a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with an energy he couldn't describe. The room was different from the rest of the Valeri palace ship. It felt ancient, sacred. The walls pulsed with a soft blue glow, and strange symbols flickered across the smooth floor. At the center of the room, Caliph knelt, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders. Before her was a small, floating crystal that shimmered with an ethereal light. Darren clenched his fists. He had agreed to this. The ritual. The bond. He wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay a prisoner. If this was the only way to break the one-sided control she had over him, then so be it. Caliph looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Guilt? Sadness? Hope? Are you ready? She asked. Darren scoffed. No, but let's get this over with. Caliph nodded and placed her hands over the floating crystal. The bond between us will now be equal, she said softly. Our minds will link completely. I will feel what you feel, and you will feel what I feel. Darren exhaled. And after that? Caliph hesitated. There is no turning back. Darren swallowed hard but stepped forward anyway. He wasn't the type to back down. She gestured for him to kneel across from her, and when he did, she pressed her hand to his chest. The crystal pulsed. Then, pain. A sharp, burning sensation rushed through his veins, like liquid fire spreading through his body. His vision blurred, his thoughts tangled. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he ended and Caliph began. He gasped, clutching his head as memories not his own flooded in. A young Caliph, standing before a towering figure, her father, the Valeri king, as he warned her of the dangers of power. Caliph, locked in the dark prison, alone, afraid, betrayed by her own brother. Caliph, feeling hope for the first time when Darren broke open her cell door. Darren sucked in a breath as the memories faded, his heart pounding. Caliph's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, she looked truly vulnerable. Now do you understand? She whispered. Darren swallowed, still trying to process everything. He didn't just see her past, he felt it. The loneliness, the fear, the heavy weight of responsibility. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as his captor, but as someone who had suffered just as much as he had. Darren exhaled. Yeah, I think I do. Before Caliph could respond, the doors burst open. Darren spun around just in time to see a group of Valeri soldiers storm into the chamber. their weapons aimed at them. And leading them, Prince Vedran. The man's golden eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he stepped forward, dressed in dark armor, his sharp features twisted into a smirk. Well, well, Vedran mused. I never expected my dear sister to bond with a human. How pathetic. Kalith stood quickly, placing herself between Darren and her brother. You have no right to be here, Vedran, she said coldly. I am the rightful heir. Vedran chuckled. Oh, Kalith, still clinging to your foolish dreams. He gestured at Darren. And this, what kind of hair binds herself to a lesser being? Darren stepped forward, his anger flaring. Say that again, pretty boy. I dare you. The prince's eyes narrowed. You dare to speak to me, human? Darren smirked. Well, yeah, I mean I did just bond with your sister, so technically, that makes me Velari royalty now, doesn't it? A ripple of shock and rage passed through the soldiers. Kalith's eyes widened. She hadn't even considered that. But Vedran's expression darkened. You think this changes anything? He lifted his hand, and a blast of energy shot toward them. Darren barely had time to react before Kalith stepped in front of him, summoning a shimmering barrier that absorbed the attack. Darren felt the force through their bond, felt her pain as she struggled to hold it back. Something inside him snapped. Without thinking, he lifted his own hand, and a pulse of energy erupted from his palm, sending Vedran stumbling backward. The prince's eyes widened in disbelief. That's impossible. Darren blinked, staring at his own hand. He had just done that. Kalith grabbed his wrist. The bond. It's given you access to my abilities. Darren grinned. Now we're talking. Vedran's expression twisted in fury. Kill them both. The soldiers surged forward. Darren didn't think. He acted. His body moved on its own, flowing like Kalith's, as if he had trained for years in Velari combat. He dodged, struck, countered, his punches landing with enough force to knock the armored warriors off their feet. Beside him, Kalith fought with equal fury, her energy blasts lighting up the chamber. For the first time since this nightmare started, Darren felt free. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He wasn't a servant. He was a warrior, a partner, and he was going to end this. The battle raged inside the grand chamber, energy blasts and clashing weapons lighting up the ancient walls. Darren and Kalith fought side by side, their movements synchronized as if they had trained together for years. Except they hadn't. It was the bond, the link that now connected them. Darren could feel Kalith's instincts, her thoughts flowing into his mind like second nature. He knew when she would dodge, when she would strike, and when she needed him to cover her. And she could feel him too. The Velari soldiers were strong, but they had never faced anything like this before. A human warrior, moving like a royal. Darren ducked under an incoming blade, then twisted, grabbing the soldier's arm and flipping him onto the floor. Another soldier rushed forward, weapon raised, but Kalith was faster. She extended her hand, sending a pulse of energy that sent the attacker flying back. Vedran watched from a distance, his golden eyes narrowing. He wasn't fighting yet. He was waiting. Darren knocked out another soldier and turned toward Kalith. We need to end this now. Kalith nodded. Agreed. They turned their focus on Vedran, who stood at the far end of the chamber, completely calm despite his soldiers falling around him. He smirked. Impressive. Truly. Darren clenched his fists. You talk too much. Vedran vanished. For a split second, Darren thought he had disappeared, until a blur of movement appeared behind him. Darren barely turned in time before Vedran struck. The force of the impact sent him crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he pushed himself up. Vedran stood between him and Kalith now, a dark aura of energy surrounding him. You bonded with a human, he sneered at his sister, and now you think you are strong. Laughable. Kalith's eyes burned with determination. You will not win, Vedran. Vedran lunged at her, their blades clashing in a blur of silver and gold. Darren forced himself to his feet, his breath heavy. He could feel Caliph struggling. Vedran was strong, too strong. Darren gritted his teeth. He couldn't let this happen. Then something clicked in his mind. The bond. Caliph had said their thoughts, emotions, and even abilities were now connected. Which meant Darren closed his eyes. He let go of his fear, his doubts. He reached deep into the bond, into Caliph's power. And then he felt it. A surge of energy rushed through him, like fire flowing through his veins. His body moved on instinct. His eyes snapped open, glowing faintly with a blue hue. Caliph dodged Vedran's next strike, and in that moment, Darren moved. With inhuman speed, he appeared beside Vedran, grabbing his wrist before he could strike Caliph again. Vedran's eyes widened in shock. What? Darren smirked, surprised. Then he punched Vedran straight in the chest. The impact sent the prince skidding across the floor, knocking over two of his own soldiers. Caliph stared at Darren, her eyes filled with surprise. How? Darren grinned. Guess we're more connected than we thought. Vedran snarled as he got back to his feet, anger flashing in his golden eyes. Enough of this. He raised his hands, summoning a massive energy blast, the force shaking the room. Caliph quickly grabbed Darren's hand. Together. Darren nodded. Yeah. Let's finish this. As Vedran unleashed his attack, Caliph and Darren moved in perfect harmony. Their combined energy surged forward, colliding with Vedran's blast. The entire room shook as the forces clashed, until finally their power overwhelmed him. Vedran screamed as he was thrown back, his energy shattering around him. He collapsed onto the floor, defeated. The remaining soldiers hesitated, then dropped their weapons. It was over. Darren let out a deep breath, exhaustion settling into his bones. He turned to Caliph. You okay? She smiled softly. Yes. Thanks to you. Darren smirked. Guess being bonded to a human isn't so bad after all, huh? Caliph chuckled. It has its advantages. She turned to the defeated Vedran. It's over, brother. Surrender. Vedran glared at her, but he was too weak to fight back. The palace guards, now realizing their true ruler had returned, knelt before Caliph. The throne is yours, my lady, one of them said. Caliph nodded. Then let us begin rebuilding our people. Darren sighed, rubbing his neck. So, what happens to me now? Caliph turned to him, something warm in her gaze. You are freed, Darren, she said softly. Darren blinked. Wait, really? Caliph stepped closer. The bond will always exist, but it will no longer control you. You are no longer my servant. You are, she hesitated, my equal. Darren exhaled, looking at the collar still around his neck. It didn't feel like a shackle anymore. It felt different. He smirked. Well, if I'm free, then I guess I should leave. Caliph's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly covered it. If that is what you wish. Darren chuckled. Relax, princess. I didn't say I would leave, just that I could. Caliph's eyes widened slightly. You mean? Darren crossed his arms. I think I'll stick around. Someone's got to make sure you don't get kidnapped again. Caliph laughed softly. Then I would be honored to have you by my side. Darren smirked. Yeah. Just don't start calling me your highness or anything. Caliph smiled. No promises. As the Valari palace erupted in cheers, Darren realized something. He had come here expecting to rescue a princess, but instead he had found something far greater. A purpose, a bond, a new home. And for the first time since this all began, he was exactly where he was meant to be.